Today in class, what we did is we talked about the different trigonometric identities. So this video is simply going to go over what we did today and a few homework problems. The trigonometric identities that we talked about today were the quotient identity, the reciprocal identities, and the Pythagorean identities. So let's start with quotient. If I say the word quotient, what comes to mind? Well, hopefully the word division comes to mind. And we already know that if I'm on the unit circle, the only place that we ever divided at was when I'm trying to find tangent and cotangent. So all I did today was make these fancy. Instead of using a y, I used the word sine. Instead of using the letter x, I used the word cosine. So the two quotient identities that we have to know for the test are tangent theta is equal to sine over cosine, and cotangent theta is equal to cosine over sine. The next three identities that we talked about in class today were the reciprocal identities. Again, you already know what your reciprocal identities are because we know our reciprocals. Today we just made it a little fancy. I know the reciprocal of sine is cosecant. So I know I go to my circle, I find my y, and I just flip it. I know that if I want the reciprocal to cosine, it's called secant. I go on my circle, I find my x, and I flip it. For tangent, we find the y and the x, and then we flip it. So our reciprocal identities, we're just going to get a little fancy. Instead of saying x and y, we're going to use the words sine and cosine. So the reciprocal identity for cosecant is 1 over sine theta. Secant is 1 over cosine theta. And for cotangent, I'm going to have 1 over tangent theta. The last three that we went over are all called Pythagorean identities. And the first Pythagorean identity I went over today was sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. And I used the picture of Phineas and Ferb to help me remember because it's something that we watched when we were little, and I was just trying to tag it to something we already knew. So a lot of times you'll hear me say in class, let's do the Phineas and Ferb. So that's sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. So one of the identities we have to know for our test is sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. This identity can be rewritten two other ways and mean the exact same thing. So I'm going to rearrange this equation. So on the left-hand side, I only have the sine squared theta. And I'm going to kick this cosine squared to the other side. And when I move it to the other side, the 1 was already there. And since I'm moving cosine squared to the opposite side, I'm going to write minus cosine squared theta. Another way to write this is to leave the cosine squared on the left and kick the sine squared to the other side. So we're going to have cosine squared theta equals, I'm going to take this sine squared and move it over here. The 1's already there, and then I have minus sine squared theta. All three of these are equivalent, and they all mean the same thing. It might be helpful to write these down for yourself, so while we're solving later on, they're just ready for you to use. The next identity we went over was the one that we call I tan in a second. So I have 1 plus tangent squared theta equals secant squared theta. I tan in a second. This can also be written two other ways, just like we did a second ago. I'm going to leave the tangent squared on the left, and I'm going to kick the 1 to the other side. So the secant squared theta is left over here on the right, and if I move that 1 over, it's now a minus 1. I'm going to do it one more time, leaving the 1 on the left and kicking the tangent over. So the 1 stays on the left equals the secant squared is on the right, and if I kick the tangent over, it's minus tangent squared theta. Again, you might want to rewrite these so that they're easy for you to get to when we're solving problems. So we've got the Phineas and Ferb, recapping, sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. And you have a theme song for that, 104 days of summer vacation. So every time I see Phineas and Ferb, that's kind of what I usually say in class. We've got the island mon, because we're on the island getting a tan. I tan in a second. And the last one we have is when we went to our favorite restaurant and we ordered dessert and the waiter asked me to cut the cheesecake. So I cut cheesecake. Again, this one's going to be written two other ways. I'm going to leave the cotangent on the left and kick the 1 to the other side. So when I kick it over, it's a -1. Then rewrite it one more time with the 1 left on the left-hand side. And I'm going to kick the cotangent over. So when we're working problems today, we want to know all of these trig identities. We want to know our quotient identities, tangent and cotangent. We want to know our reciprocal identities. Cosecant is 1 over sine, secant is 1 over cosine, cotangent is 1 over tangent. And we want to know our 3 Pythagorean identities. Our Phineas and Ferb, sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. Our Islandman, I tan in a second, 1 plus tangent squared equals secant squared. And our fancy restaurant, I cut the cheesecake, 1 plus cotangent squared equals cosecant squared. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this video is I'm going to work a few problems that I did in class today, and then I'm going to work the 2 that I asked you to try tonight. At the top of this worksheet are all the identities that we just went over. And in class today, we worked 9 through 13. I think I was able to do 9, 11, and 13 with you, and I asked you to try 10 and 12 tonight. So I'm going to go through 9, 11, and 13 again. That way if you missed something in class today, you have an opportunity to try again. So the directions for this whole front page are very simple. It says you're going to simplify each trigonometric expression by following the indicated directions. So no matter what you feel like doing, the first thing you do is you follow the directions and then you simplify. That's the key. So number 9. Number 9 says to rewrite in terms of sine and cosine. That means the only words that I want to see on number 9 are the words sine and cosine. So instead of writing tangent theta, I come up here and I'm trying to figure out what's another way to write tangent using the words sine and cosine. At the top, I can use my quotient identity, and I can write tangent as sine over cosine. So in place of the word tangent, I'm going to write sine theta over cosine theta. And then I'm going to put my little time sign, just like what was written right here. And then I'm going to go do cosecant. So look back at the top again, cosecant. Instead of writing cosecant, I'm going to write 1 over sine theta. So I'm going to put times 1 over sine theta. Now, I know that when I'm multiplying fractions, that I can cross cancel. So I know this sign and that sign, poof, they're gone. They cancel out. All I have left on the top is 1, and on the bottom, we have a cosine theta. And that's our final answer. All right, if you would, pause the video, go try number 10, and then come back and check with me that you did it right. All right, number 10. So hopefully you've tried it already. So number 10, same directions. I'm going to rewrite cotangent theta and secant theta using only the words sine and cosine. So I see cotangent, and I saw people doing this in class today. They went up here to cotangent, and they wanted to write it as 1 over tan. Now there's nothing wrong with that, except the directions say to only use the words sine and cosine. If I use this, that doesn't say sine and cosine. So there's got to be another one. So I go further up, cotangent can be written as cosine over sine. So that's the one I'm going to use. So right there where it says cotangent, I'm going to write cosine theta over sine theta. And then it says times, so I put a times, and then it says secant. So I use my rules again. For secant, I'm going to write 1 over cosine. So for secant, in place of that word, I'm going to write 1 over cosine. And then we're going to see it happens again. That I'm multiplying fractions, so I can cross cancel. And when I cross cancel, I'm left with a 1 on top and a sine theta on the bottom. And we're done. So you might see something like either one of these on your test where they ask you to rewrite it in terms of sine and cosine, and then you have to simplify. In order to be able to do either of these two problems on the test, you have to know these identities. If you don't know these identities, you won't be able to do problems like 9 and 10. All right. The next one we did in class was number 11. And I have to follow the directions. The directions for number 11 ask me to multiply the top of the fraction by 1 plus sine and the bottom of the fraction by 1 plus sine. So I know some of y'all wanted to cross cancel and get rid of stuff, but that defeats the purpose. They want me to actually go through and multiply. So that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to go to number 11 again, even though I did it in class. So number 11. I'm going to write down what I'm about to do. I'm going to do exactly what it says. It says to take cosine theta on the top and multiply it by 1 plus sine theta. And it says to take 1 minus sine theta on the bottom, and they want me to multiply that by 1 plus sine theta. So this is when a lot of people are like, oh, Ms. L, just reduce and cross things out. I can't do that because they asked me to go multiply. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to go multiply, and I'm going to get my answer. Okay, so if I go multiply the top, we're going to FOIL or distribute. So we're going to have cosine times 1 is going to give me, write it down here, cosine theta, and cosine times sine is going to just give me cosine sine. You just write them right beside each other. We're multiplying them. I'm going to do the same thing on the bottom. This time we are going to FOIL. I'm going to do 1 times 1. You get 1. I'm going to do 1 times sine. You get a positive sine. Okay. And then I'm going to go multiply everything by the negative sign. So negative sine times 1 is negative sine. And a negative sine times a positive sine is a negative sine squared. Remember, anything times itself is squared, so sine times sine is sine squared. Now that I've multiplied, I'm going to go follow the rest of my directions. It said to simplify. So I'm going to try to see if anything can be simplified. Well, nothing can really be simplified on the top right now. On the bottom, I see that I have a sine theta and a minus sine theta. So those are going to cross out. So I'm going to go rewrite what I have. I've got cosine theta plus cosine theta sine theta all over 1 minus sine squared theta. Now, I'm going to use one of those identities that we talked about. 104 days of summer vacation. I'm thinking about my Phineas and Ferb that we wrote down earlier. So earlier we said that if I ever had a 1 minus sine squared, it was the same as cosine squared. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to take the bottom of my fraction where it says 1 minus sine squared, and I know that 1 minus sine squared is the exact same thing as cosine squared. So I'm going to take out the 1 minus sine squared and put this in its place because it says that they are equal. All right, so equals. On the top, I still have the same thing for now. But on the bottom, I'm going to take that whole 1 minus sine squared and I'm going to replace it with the word cosine squared. Okay, so let's revisit one more time why I did that. Okay, so we said that Phineas and Ferb, I could rewrite this bunches of ways, and one of the ways that I rewrote it was 1 minus sine squared. So I know 1 minus sine squared is the exact same thing as the word cosine squared. So I'm taking out the word sine, 1 minus sine squared, I'm putting cosine squared in its place. Now what we're hoping that you see is that I've got a cosine, and a cosine. So we're going to factor out a cosine. So on the top, I'm going to factor out a cosine, cosine theta, parentheses. I'm going to divide everything on the top by cosine. Cosine divided by cosine is 1. Cosine sine divided by cosine is just sine. All over cosine squared theta. By factoring this cosine out, I can now cross cancel. I've got a cosine to the first and a cosine squared. So this and this cosine reduce, and all I have left on top is 1 plus sine theta over cosine theta. And that's our final answer. Okay, so we're going to go try it again. I want you to go try number 12. Use the exact same steps. Go multiply by exactly what it tells you to multiply by. Go distribute. Go FOIL. Cross stuff out. Use one of your properties. And then see what you can reduce. Check back in just a second to see if you got it right. All right, hopefully by now you've tried number 12. So let's look at what it told me to do. So number 12, the directions tell me that I need to multiply the top of the fraction by 1 minus cosine. And I'm going to multiply the bottom of the fraction by 1 minus cosine. So I'm going to go write down what they told me to do. So sine theta times 1 minus cosine over, the bottom one is 1 plus cosine theta. They want me to multiply it by 1 minus cosine theta. All right, so we're just going to go do the work, just like we did on number 11. Sine times 1 is sine. Sine times negative cosine is going to be negative cosine sine. Again, the order doesn't really matter. I usually do it alphabetical. Now I'm going to go do the bottom. We're going to FOIL. 1 times 1 is 1. 1 times negative cosine is negative cosine. Now I'm going to go multiply everything over here by the cosine. Cosine times 1 is a positive cosine. And cosine times negative cosine is a negative cosine squared. Because cosine times cosine is going to be a cosine squared. So hopefully you see that negative cosine and positive cosine cancel out. So on the top, we're left with sine theta minus cosine theta sine theta. On the bottom, I have 1 minus cosine squared theta. So I'm hoping you go, oh, it's Phineas and Ferb again. 104 days of summer vacation. So let's go look. What is she talking about? Well, do you see how I have 1 minus cosine squared right here? What does it say I can replace it with? I can replace 1 minus cosine squared with the phrase or the word sine squared theta. So right here where I have 1 minus cosine squared, I'm going to take that out and I'm going to replace it with sine squared. So I'm going to go rewrite the top again. Sine theta minus cosine sine all over. I just said I'm going to replace this whole thing with the word sine squared theta. Now we can see that I've got a sine, sine, and a sine. So I'm going to factor out the word sine. Sine will go into sine once. Sine will go into cosine sine once, and I'm left with cosine. And then I have a sine squared theta. So I have a sine and a sine squared. The sine on top is going to go away completely. I'm only going to have a sine on the bottom, not a sine squared anymore. My final answer is 1 minus cosine over sine. And that's number 12. The last one I'm going to do on this video is number 13. We did that one in class. I did not ask y'all to try 14 tonight, so right now we're just going to go over number 13. So on number 13, remember you do the directions first and then you simplify. The directions say to rewrite over a common denominator. To find a common denominator, you can simply multiply the two denominators that you do have. So the denominators that I do have are cosine and sine. So all I'm going to do is multiply these together to get my new denominator. Well, if I multiply this bottom one by sine to get the new denominator, I also have to multiply the top by sine. If I multiply the bottom of the second one by cosine, I also have to multiply the top by cosine. So I'm going to multiply everything on the first fraction by sine and everything in the second fraction by cosine. I'm going to go write down what I just said. The first fraction is going to get multiplied by sine. Okay, so I multiplied that top by sine. I put a plus sign. The second fraction is going to get multiplied by cosine. And it's all over. If I multiply those together, I get cosine sine. Okay, so all I did was rewrite the problem. I haven't done the work yet. So I'm going to go multiply both of these terms by sine. Sine times sine is sine squared. Sine times cosine is cosine sine. And again, the order doesn't matter. If you want to write the sine first, that's fine. I'm going to do the same thing over here. Cosine times cosine is cosine squared. Cosine times negative sine is a negative cosine sine. And the bottom, I'm just going to rewrite cosine sine. Okay, on the top, I hope that you see that some things cancel again. I've got a positive cosine sine. I have a negative cosine sine. I have a positive and a negative of the same thing, so poof, they're gone. They disappear. We are left with sine squared theta plus, my fault, cosine squared theta. This is what we're left with on the top. On the bottom, we're left with cosine sine. I'm hoping when you see sine squared plus cosine squared, again, you're thinking, oh, Phineas and Ferb again. 104 days of summer vacation. What can I go replace sine squared plus cosine with? What does sine squared plus cosine squared equal? I can replace both of these words with the number 1. So I'm going to go rewrite this as 1 over cosine theta sine theta. There you go. And that gets us through what we did today. Hope this helped. Watch it a couple more times. Ask me questions in class tomorrow.